If China attacks Taiwan, the U.S. Navy's nuclear-powered submarines could be the first forces to take shots at the Chinese invasion fleet. How many Chinese ships the quiet, heavily armed American attack boats can sink, and how quickly, could make all the difference in the apocalyptic war. A successful U.S. submarine campaign could help bring the conflict to a swift end, preserving Taiwan's independence and blunting China's global ambitions. A failed undersea campaign, on the other hand, could invite Chinese dominion over Taiwan and the whole Western Pacific region. Win or lose, the U.S. Navy should brace for heavy losses. Even a victorious USN subfleet could suffer staggering casualties in battle with the Chinese Navy around Taiwan. That's one sobering result of a series of war games organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. In most of the 24 iterations of the game, submarines were able to enter the Chinese defensive zone and wreak havoc with the Chinese fleet, the CIS analysts concluded. But even in the scenarios that were optimistic for Taiwanese and Allied victory, the U.S. undersea force, which today numbers 53 nuclear-powered attack and cruise missile submarines, lost up to a quarter of its boats and thousands of sailors. The losses are indicative of the intensity of the submarine campaign that CSIS projected. The think tank assumed the U.S. would commit all or most of its undersea fleet to a war with China, perhaps setting aside just a few boats to continue shadowing Russian ballistic missile subs. The 40 or 50 submarines would organize in squadrons of 4 boats apiece and deploy to U.S. bases in Guam, at Wake Island, and in Yokosuka, Japan. One squadron should be on station in the narrow Taiwan Strait when the first Chinese rockets fall and the invasion fleet sets sail. In CSIS's war games, those 4 boats sank Chinese ship after Chinese ship until their torpedoes and missiles ran out or Chinese forces hunted them down. The other 9 or 10 USN sub-squadrons meanwhile synchronized into what the analysts described as an undersea conveyor belt. They hunted, moved back to port, reloaded, then moved forward again and hunted, the analyst explained. According to CSIS, each submarine would sink 2 large amphibious vessels and an equal number of escorts during each 3.5-day turn. In 2 weeks of intensive fighting in the war games, the submarines sank as many as 64 Chinese ships, including many of the PLA Navy's biggest amphibious ships and surface combatants, and potentially some of the PLA Navy's aircraft carriers as well. The Chinese ships that succeeded in avoiding American submarines weren't safe, of course. The same CSIS war games found that U.S. Air Force bombers, firing stealthy cruise missiles from 460 miles away, posed an even greater danger to Chinese ships than did U.S. Navy submarines. Specifically, it was the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, a stealthy, air-launched cruise missile that's compatible with an array of USAF and USN warplanes that helped to win the war, by sinking most of the Chinese fleet over the course of 2 bloody weeks, starting with the first Chinese rocket barrage on Taiwanese bases. The JASSM is a special case, the CSIS analysts wrote. Its long-range precision guidance and stealthy characteristics make it an important munition for the United States. JASSM-ER debuted in 2018. The U.S. Air Force is buying the new missiles as quickly as Lockheed Martin can make them. CSIS projected the service would have more than 3,600 JASSM-ERs in 2026, the year in which its Taiwan war games were set. In the scenario where the Taiwanese and their allies won most decisively, the Chinese amphibious and transport fleet lost 90% of its ships and was unable to supply the few Chinese battalions the fleet had managed to land on Taiwan. With no sea lines of communication, Chinese troops on the island quickly ran out of fuel and ammunition. But even that decisive victory came at a high cost for the Americans. Chinese escorts, aircraft, and submarines sank a fifth of the deployed American subs every 3 or 4 days throughout the 2-week war. In the end, perhaps a dozen or more American submarines lay wrecked at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, radioactive tombs for as many as 2,000 submariners. In light of their disproportionate contribution to the Taiwan campaign, submarines absolutely should be a top priority in U.S. defense planning, the analysts wrote. Given the value of submarines, acquiring more is an obvious recommendation. That's easier said than done when a single nuclear attack boat costs around $3 billion, and just a handful of American shipyards can build their components. The Pentagon plans to acquire 2 attack boats a year for the foreseeable future in order to maintain, and eventually grow, the overall undersea force. The U.S. Navy should commit to funding those 2 per year even if shipbuilding funds get tight, CSIS recommended. The Navy also could speed up the subfleet's expansion by keeping older boats in service longer. If the think tank's war games are predictive, the U.S. fleet will need every submarine it can muster in order to defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.